Cool. All right. This is a talk on pair programming interviews. So it's sort of briefly going to cover sort of the goals of a pair programming interview, how you would want to approach setting it up and being prepared, then the actual interview itself, and then a little bit on how to do a good write-up of your interview. Really quick for people who have never done pair programming. Pair programming is when two engineers are working together, usually on one computer. It often is sort of described as a driver-navigator paradigm where one person will be on the keyboard and the other person will be sort of guiding them. Which doesn't mean that it should ever be one person doing all of the work. It should always be a conversation back and forth. It should never be the driver just sort of doing everything, and it should never be the navigator just sort of dictating exactly everything to do. Why do we use pair programming for interviews? Because a lot of common tech interview approaches aren't very good. A lot of places do algorithms, data structures, and stuff on the whiteboard. That's really not a very good simulation of what you'll be doing on the job. And mostly what it tells you is whether the person has recently taken an algorithms class. Some places also do like a big take-home project. That kind of selects in favor of people who have a lot of free time, which we don't necessarily want to do. And it also, you don't actually get to see them work, and you can't really guarantee that the work they turn in is actually their own. So with pair programming, it's a more reasonable approach. Some of those drawbacks that other common interviews have. The goal of a pair programming interview is for the interview to develop an idea of what it's like to work with a candidate. Some of the questions that you want to think about as you're doing the interview are things like, is the candidate someone I'd like to work with? And would hiring the candidate make the team stronger? And it will also be really obvious if they just completely can't code. It is not the goal to intimidate the candidate or to quiz the candidate on specifics of the libraries or languages that you're using. It's also not the goal, when I'm doing these interviews, for them to complete a specific amount of work within the interview. Obviously, if they get more work done, that's better than if they don't, but it's not the main thing that I'm looking for. It's an open book interview, meaning they can ask me anything. They can Google anything. One of the most important parts of being a software engineer is knowing how to use the resources available to you. So if someone is getting stuck and they're not asking questions, they're not looking things up, that's a bad sign. They're not making good use of the resources they have. And all of these things about the goals, the non-goals, and asking questions, I always make sure to tell the candidate that at the start of the interview so that they know and don't get stuck. All right, setup and being prepared. You probably want to know in advance what you're going to be pairing on with the candidate so that you don't have to waste any time looking for it. I would suggest normally that you pick something that you are comfortable with because they're going to have questions about it and you should be able to answer them usually. You should also have your general workstation set up for the interview. Have your editor open, have like an incognito Chrome or something, have your terminal open to whatever workspace the work is in so you're not clicking around trying to find stuff. Interviews are stressful. The candidates are probably going to be nervous. We want to set them up to succeed rather than throwing things in front of them for them to trip over, which means it's a really bad idea to force candidates to use difficult tools that they're not familiar with. And so I have one actual transition in the entire slideshow. No Vim, no Emacs, please. They are very difficult to use if you're not familiar with them. And We don't want to trip up candidates on things like this. Okay, on to the actual interview part. Beginning of the interview, you should probably introduce yourself. You should probably have the candidate introduce themselves. This should be very brief, just a few minutes. You don't need to walk through their entire life's history. That's not really relevant, and it's not the goal of the interview. You should introduce them to the problem or project that you're working on. For front-end work, you'd probably want to show them the actual part of the product that relates to it, so they have some idea of what they're doing. For back-end work, something similar probably. I like to, before we actually start coding together, suggest that we take a couple of minutes to plan out our approach to the problem. Some candidates like to spend a lot of time doing this, some don't. I usually leave it more or less up to them. I don't want to force them to have a long conversation before they get started if they don't want to. But I also don't want to force them to get started with no plan if they don't want to. It can be helpful to have like a whiteboard or some scratch paper or something like that for this as well. And then you get into the actual pair programming. Normally what I've found is that the candidate will spend most of the time as the driver and also sort of half navigator. So most of the time they should be at the keyboard. They should be one writing the code, and they should be explaining what they're doing as they go. And the interviewer is more of a navigator, guiding them, asking questions. These roles can be switched. There are some good reasons for the interviewer to be on the keyboard. Like, for example, if the candidate has a ton of experience in the sort of thing that you're working on, having them guide you would be an interesting way to see how they can teach you. In some cases, there also may be sort of trivial, like boilerplate code that just needs to be put down, and you don't really expect them to know exactly how it goes. That would be another good time for the interviewer to sort of get the code up on the screen, explain what it's doing, and then switch back. Questions. Questions are important. Candidate is working in code that is not familiar to them. They should be asking lots of questions, especially if what you're working on is not in their exact area of expertise. They should be just in learning mode. You should be in teaching mode. They should be asking about anything they don't understand. I would much, much rather have a candidate literally stop on every line of code and be like, I don't know what this is doing. Can you please explain it to me? And then have them just sit there staring, not saying anything. Or copy pasting code, putting things up that they have no idea what it's actually doing. If the work is very familiar to them, they should be asking smart, like high-level questions. They should be noticing things that you've done and asking why they were done that way, etc. Asking why you chose tools that you're using. Debugging. You'll hit bugs. That's a good thing. Watching a candidate debug can tell you a lot about how they work. You get to see how they handle problems, which is important. You don't want to waste time, though, on bugs that are sort of like trivia, basically, where it's like some specific thing of some tool that you're using that just throws certain bugs because of stupid, trivial things that you don't need to expect someone who doesn't normally use that library to know. So that's not something you want to waste time on. So something like, for example, React components needing class name instead of class. That's going to throw tons of bugs for somebody who doesn't know that, and you don't want to waste a bunch of time having them sit there and stare at it and not know what to do. Those sorts of things, you can just tell them how to fix. There's nothing wrong with that. Taking notes. You want to take notes. You want to take lots of notes. I usually end up with about 4 or 5 pages of notes for a 2-hour interview. You'll also want like a notebook or paper or something to take notes on because they will be using it. And you don't want them to see all your notes probably. You want to take notes of facts. Write down things that are happening, things that they say, things that they do, how they react to things that you say and do. You might also want to note context and your thoughts or impressions of what's going on, sort of so that you remember it later, but that's not mainly what you're after here. You'll probably want to start wrapping up the interview a few minutes before your time's up. So far, I've been sort of at about 10 or 15 minutes to the end of the time, start looking for a natural ending point. So there will be a few minutes for them to ask any questions, and for you to ask them some questions like how you would improve on what you worked on. If you didn't write tests, how would you test it? Those sorts of things. Don't need super detailed answers, but you want them thinking about it. And they can ask you anything this as well. How to do a killer write-up. I'm told I'm very good at doing interview write-ups. I don't know if I believe it, but people keep telling me that. So. It could be. There's three main parts to the way that I've been writing up interviews, which is pretty much exactly how Pat suggested that I do it. So props to him for that. The first and arguably most important part is facts. You want to include in your write-up. Well, basically a list of things that happened. Things the candidate said, things that they did. This usually ends up being sort of like an abbreviated version of my notes, like take out all the repetitive, they did this, did it again and again and again and again sort of thing. Include context so that they make sense for people reading it, but you don't want commentary mixed in. The next part is my commentary on what happened. So it's sort of an interpretation of different things that happened, my feelings towards the way they did things, maybe additional context. And then the actual conclusion, overall impression of the candidate, and your ultimate recommendation. It should answer things like, did you get a good idea of what it's like to work with the candidate? Sometimes you won't, and that makes it really hard to make a final call. And then, do you think that hiring them will make the team stronger? Why or why not? And this should be based on your facts. Sort of higher level goals for the write-up. Pat or whoever is reading it should be able to understand how you reached your conclusion. And the facts that you give them should be good enough that they can come up with their own impression of the candidate that may or may not be the same as yours. You get your own opinion, but you don't get your own facts. And your opinion isn't always going to be the same as someone else's, and that's fine, provided that you're both working from the same information and can follow how the other person came up with their recommendation. Questions, comments, etc.
Okay, so I just the part where you said there that like a candidate should ask lots of questions. Does that mean that when I start one of these interviews, I should encourage the person, ask questions,
Yes.
and make sure they do?
Yeah.
Or does that mean if a person just kind of sits there and solves the problem without really talking to me, that's a fail? Or
it's not necessarily a fail.
Yeah.
It's better than them sitting there and not solving the problem and not talking to you for sure.
Yeah.
If they're able to get through it without asking a lot of questions, that's not a bad thing, but you should encourage them to if they have questions.
Yeah, no, it's just the way that you phrased it. It's like, they should ask questions.
It's important.
As opposed to they typically do.
The thing is, some of them typically don't.
Okay.
And those are the people who I end up saying no hire on.
Okay, yeah, see, that's the...
Is there ever any time you want to distribute voice in one meeting after you and just sit there and take notes?
Possibly.
Are you able to split your time for
I haven't really had a problem with it, and over at my workstation, that ends up feeling really crowded.
What about just recording the interview and taking notes on it after?
You could do that. That would also,
It's a lot of time.
yeah. I do also save the code that they write, so that's another reference for the write-up. The one case that I think might actually not be a bad idea for bringing in a third person would be to have at least some amount of time with a designer. Pat has mentioned to me, and I also totally agree with him that, all of us are men. Most of our candidates are men. It would be nice to see them interact with a potential coworker who's a woman. I think there are a lot of red flags that might come up there that we would want to avoid in someone we're hiring. Plus, seeing how somebody works with a designer, especially for a front-end person, could be very valuable.
Great.
Jacob.
Yes.
Okay, so a couple of questions. When you have somebody that you're struggling to make an opinion on, when have you discovered that you're kind of like, I don't know how I feel about this person? How have you kind of tried to come to an opinion about that person?
I guess it would depend on why. In the case that I've gotten like a lot of conflicting information, then it would be more of, I don't know, just trying to think more about what's important. And then my overall sort of gut feeling about the person would probably have more influence than it normally would. In the case where it's difficult because I don't feel like I got a good impression of what it would be like to work with them. So far, at least, I've tended to sort of round that down.
Okay.
I don't want to recommend hiring someone when I don't feel confident in saying that they would make the team strong.
Okay. First of all, Jacob, this was freaking awesome. I love it. Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation. The second thing is that as everyone walks out of this room, you're going to be asked at some point or another to do an equivalent pair programming exercise. And Jacob has his style. You're going to have your own. But what Jacob outlined is completely correct. And you're going to have to figure out all these same questions that Jacob had to figure out, which is, if I have somebody and I get an initial impression of it, how do I validate it so I can write down the facts that validate that positive impression? And, and come up with your own style that you can use to pull out the best of every candidate. Okay? But this is an ongoing dialogue, and I encourage everybody to think about what they would add to Jacob's presentation if they were to give it in the future themselves. But thanks again, Jacob. This is really, really good. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Could you share that with me too? That's great.
Everything? Yeah, I'll send it to you.
Hi, Pat.
Okay.